Fear and Loathing, but mostly fear, in the Poconos. I'll probably get a lot of cool story bro kind of responses from this, but I swear the parts that I experienced myself are true, and to the best of my knowledge what everyone else experienced is true as well. After being your general burned out, blue-collar post-hippies just trying to raise a family, my parents both became born-again Christians about the time I was 12. Deciding myself at roughly the same time that I didn't believe in a Christian God, for the next 6 years of my life I dealt with their incessant proselytizing, intolerance, unwarranted piousness, and ignorance until literally the week I turned 18, at which point I found myself an apartment. I had somewhat recently been hired out of a work placement program in the graphic arts class I attended at Votech into a fairly comfortable job at the Pocono Record as the paper's paginator. Basically, you print negatives to be prepared for the next step in the physical paper printing process. I'd had this job for about 6 months or so, and since living with my parents incurred little to no expense, my above minimum wage job allowed me to save enough money for the moving costs of my own place. Not having much of a credit history or verifiable rental background relegated me to the seedier apartments in town. Pretty much anywhere that didn't require an application was the same shade of run-down and no-class desperation. Wood paneling, ancient basic furnishings, tubs, stoves, refrigerators, etc. God-awful shag carpeting, 90th coating of pea soup green paint holes in the wall. Every place literally felt like a glorified version of any hotel room you've ever seen in a late 70s movie Coke deal. Attempting to be precise, I accidentally prolonged my search for such an apartment. The desire to be free of my parents' reign, coupled with some recent trouble I had stirred at their house by way of my youthful drinking and drug abuse, forced my hand and I settled on perhaps the most decrepit and forlorn of these overpriced hellholes. 288, North Cortlandt Street, East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. You can Google Earth it if you like, but the clean, modern-looking triplex that stands there now is built on the burned-down rubble of what was once a tenement full of bizarre happenings. Having paid all the necessary move-in fees, I actually didn't move in until a few days later. However, my good friend S was newly homeless and needed a place to crash. Informing him that the apartment was bare of any kind of furnishing aside from the ultimately basic, S's situation was desperate enough that he agreed to stay there regardless. He was out by the time I moved in a day or two after. Fast forward past the tearful goodbyes from my parents and the advice to my younger brother to get out as soon as you can, to the first night in my very own, albeit sparsely appointed flat. I lay down to go to sleep and seriously could not. A persistent feeling of dread crept its way into my chest and refused to leave. I chalked this up simply to new place jitters and the fact that the place was run down and certainly a far cry from the clean, lower middle class house my parents had kept since they were able to afford a house of their own instead of the junk pile apartments like these that we lived in when I was a kid. Those kinds of places weirded me out back then, and they are still do to this day. Something about the inevitable inability of not knowing what has taken place in the very room you're in throughout the long years that place has been there sets the mind wandering grim sidewalks. This place, in particular, was clearly old. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed, got dressed and hunted down some friends with which to party, one of them being S. It didn't occur to me until much later, but that night S asked me if there was anyone living in the basement, as he had heard someone knocking on the underside of the floor he slept on early in the pre-dawn morning before I had moved in. Like something someone might do to alert a noisy upstairs tenant to quiet down. I'd never been down there before and, to the best of my knowledge, no one lived down there. In my room was a door to the basement. We headed down there and found no one. No furnishings, just an old, empty, unfinished basement with the typical contents of the bowels of an old house. Thinking back, I assume we were too inebriated for the chain of events that led us down there for it to register as just this side of eerie as hell. After having a great deal of my teenage wild years somewhat suppressed by my fundamentalist parents, it's safe to say I went out of my way to make my house and the crew that surrounded me as wild a bunch as possible. We consumed drugs by the barrelful. Drinking was constant. On top of that we were, and still are to some extent, what I guess you'd call rivet heads. We looked like thugs and acted like something that slagged its way out of a splatterpunk novel. By all logic, we should have been locked up for half the thing we did, and living across the street from the town high school should have, theoretically, made things much worse. AM visits from the police were frequent and they just as frequently left, shaking their heads, no charges filed. The conclusion we came to was that they might have been scared of us. We were pretty much the kind of guys from those old PSA ads about keeping your kids from becoming strung-out low-level middle school drug dealers. I don't think the police really believed that people like us existed, so when they saw us in the wild they were caught off guard. I say this not necessarily to outline myself as some kind of mythical, literary criminal person, but to help illustrate the fact that the floor above us was an even more bizarre scenario. Starting about the second night I moved in, and lasting pretty much until we evacuated the premises, thunderous noises could be heard repeatedly crashing on the floor above our heads. You know that sound when someone gets body slammed onto a wrestling mat? Something like a toned-down version of that. Relentlessly. At times for days on end. The occupants upstairs were an odd duo. If I recall, or was informed correctly, they were a father and son. The father was quite old. In his 60s or so. Rotund. I barely ever saw him, as he hardly left the house. Rumor has it, he was a PCP chemist. Awful smells came from the above apartment at times, and always the sound of someone smashing onto the floor. The son was in his 30s. Typical build. Unremarkable looking sort of fellow, but hyper. My first encounter with him was standing on my porch one day as he ran, full speed, down the outside steps from his apartment, leapt off the ledge of the trashed, raised concrete flower bed that bordered the sidewalk from my porch, landed in full lotus on a manhole cover and began some manner of chanting. I have no way of knowing this, but I suspect that maneuver was the cause of the days-long slamming noises on the floor above us. Presently, my place has become a flophouse. I had probably 10 to 13 people in my one-bedroom shotgun cave of an apartment at any given time. Winter crept in. The insulation was non-existent. At times we took to boiling water on the stove with the oven on, door open just to raise the temperature in the house a few meager degrees. A futility, given that, not only would the heat dissipate in the insulation-devoid kitchen, but the act would frequently trip the kitchen and living room breaker, causing us to go flip the breakers down in the basement which had now become filled with rotting garbage. I hadn't bothered to learn what day was garbage day upon moving in, so I initially stashed a few bags in the basement, intending to put them out on the curb when I knew what day the trash was picked up. Eventually, in our aggravated state of drug abuse, we ceased carrying and often tossed garbage bags and empty bottles down the stairs for fun. A friend, high on cough syrup and liquor, once dove down the stairs and rolled about in months' worth of trash and broken glass claiming it was fun. We were amazed when he didn't contract some sort of skin or blood poisoning from the stunt. Disgusting as this sounds, I provide this detail to further illustrate that no one would inhabit the basement willingly. Even the world's most hardcore home bomb wouldn't, and couldn't exist in what was, no exaggeration, 2 feet of rotting trash. Despite this, the people who stayed in my living room started complaining of thumping noises from the underside of the floor. As if someone in the basement had a broomstick and was tapping the floor from below to tell us to shut up or go to rehab or something. Always at the very darkest of early morning hours. About this time, decor in the flat started evolving. Sick of the drabwood paneling, we all took to covering the house in collage while high or bored. Every available wall was covered with cutouts from encyclopedias, magazines, comic books, etc. It became something of an art project, but the subject matter was extremely dark. For example, above the bathroom door was a black and white photo of a woman in a go-go outfit splayed out suggestively on a couch with an axe wedged deeply into her forehead. The accompanying text read "Easy Girl." Several of the more disturbing panels from the recently released Johnny, the Homicidal Maniac graphic novel adorned our glass-paneled front door, morbidly greeting our visitors. Occasionally, unsuspecting company in tow of the ragtag and nearly endless parade of people who stopped by to hang out or buy drugs would flat-out refuse to stay in the house after entering, claiming the place had a bad vibe. My own mother stayed for a total of 10 minutes before leaving, visibly alarmed. She didn't call for a period of about 2 months afterward. One night, none of us were able to sleep. It was exceptionally early in the morning and the core 4 of us who lived there, myself, my friend Jay, and my friends L and S, sat huddled in the dim, frozen light of my bedroom discussing the feeling of trepidation the place gave us. That same feeling of dread from when I had moved in had not subsided. Frequently it was obliterated by how disturbed I was, but whenever I was conscious enough to detect its presence, it lingered, thrived, even. Here we were having a discussion about how all of us felt the exact same dull pit in the middle of our chests, like the flat was a focal point of apprehension. By now everyone, separately, had experienced the knocking from beneath the floor. I think it was at this point that we realized just how frightening that noise was. A persistent, unexplained counterpoint to the madness above that we could barely explain as well, but at least we're certain was human. Well, mostly certain. It would be easy to chalk this all up to delusional drug paranoia. I kid you not when I claim we literally consumed drugs and alcohol constantly. All kinds, without discrepancy. If we ran out of conventional things, we'd look up OTC sit on the computer. Bottles full of Dramamine, cough syrup, ephedrine. We'd huff starter fluid for the ether content, scrape weed pipes for the resin, roll the crackheads, whatever. Thing is though, we were so busy consuming a vast variety of drugs that we weren't so strung out on one particular thing as to not be able to later tell the difference between reality and drug-induced fantasy or hallucination. One night, our fears regarding the unnatural reality of the house were literally proven correct. It was late. It was always late. We were night owls and we liked it that way. The core four of us sat in my room huddled beneath the ratty, infrequently washed blankets or sleeping bags we owned, playing video games, and listening to my 5-disc changer bookshelf stereo crank out Meat Bead Manifesto or something along those lines. GoldenEye was our constant companion. We would unremittingly hunt each other down for hours and hours, flinging vile trash talk at each other that would often come to the brink of inciting physical violence. We smoked pot and drank, the standard atmosphere for one of these kinds of gaming sessions at my house. I must have forgotten to put the disc player on endless repeat because after a few hours it stopped entirely and the only sound audible was the low-volume gunfire from the TV. Randomly, Jay paused the game and hushed us. "You hear that?" We listened in silence. Footsteps were slowly creaking up the stairs from the basement to the door in my room. We sat, paralyzed with fear. Time practically stopped. For some reason, none of us were reacting. The footsteps reached the top stair and ceased. We stared at each other, jaws slack, waiting uselessly for whatever was on the other side of the door. I snapped and sprang from the bed, grabbing a bludgeon of some kind. Silently, everyone fell into a defensive backup position. My hand trembled for the knob and, incredibly, it began to turn before I could reach it. I hesitated briefly and finally ripped the door open. No one was there. I have little memory of what happened afterward. There was chaos and confusion. We locked the door and never opened it again. I think we just sat there till daylight drinking and smoking pot, praying whatever that just happened wasn't going to happen again. Mercifully, it didn't. Halloween rolled in around a month or two later. The core four of us had a Halloween tradition of tripping balls on LSD. After a particularly insane experience at a rave in the middle of bumfuck Egypt, frying on double-dipped white fluffs while having earlier snorted a few bags of heroin, I returned to the house with a 20 strip of some appropriately printed blotter with little Frankenstein's monster heads on each hit. These lasted us a few days, and Elle didn't get around to taking one until a few days later when most of us were in recovery mode. Elle dropped in the early evening and was coming down early the next morning, listening to music on the porch by himself. I was either asleep or comatose at the time, but I vaguely recall Elle running into the house to inform us that some creepy old woman had ambled up the sidewalk opposite the house, stopped square in front of the apartment and stared, dead-eyed at him, mouth agape. The story took no more than a minute to relay and, having recruited one of us to go further investigate a potentially interesting scenario, Elle and company returned to the porch to find no visible trace of a woman Elle claimed took several minutes to lumber up a street with a good amount of visibility and open space. They took a quick survey of the local neighborhood nooks, but found no trace of her. Something about the look on the old woman's face sincerely unnerved Elle. He was in an odd mood the rest of the morning. Things continued on their downward spiral of drug and alcohol-fueled mayhem. We were evicted from the place and left not too long after the old woman's disappearing act. I'd heard various stories of lesser acquaintances inhabiting the unit and vague mumblings of related creepiness. Sometime after that the place burned to the ground. It remained an empty, raised lot for a while before some developer bought it and put up some condominiums or something. Years later, Elle and I were reminiscing about the sheer madness of the place and the time. Elle's father has lived in the Poconos for nearly all his life. He's a bit of an authority on weird local history. Elle told me he was bullshitting with his dad one day about the old North Cortlandt Street house. He said his dad dug out an old black and white photograph of the house. An elderly woman Elle recognized peered out from behind heavy curtains. Incredulous, Elle inquired as to who the woman was. Elle's dad said she was just a lonely old lady the kids used to taunt and call a witch. She died alone in that house, and no one found her for weeks. I'm willing to bet I know where in the house it was that she died. And then a skeleton popped out. Wow, great writing. I've been reading No Sleep for a while now, and many of the stories can easily be written off as fairy tales, but every once in a while a story really hits home. This story has literally hit home, as I am also a resident of the Poconos and live not more than 15 minutes away from where this story took place. I can honestly say this is the first and only story I have read that has terrified me to a point I never thought could be possible on No Sleep. Bravo, good sir, you have accomplished what this subreddit has set out to do, that being not allowing me to sleep now. How are you still alive? Great read, man. I particularly like the story, exceedingly written, creepy as hecko, and the title, amazing on so many levels. Thank you so much. I used to live in the Poconos. Most of my family lives in Stroudsburg and East Stroudsburg. I'll have to take a drive by the place next time I am down there. That is awesome and reminds me of stupid things my friends and I would do wasted. I thumbed up the title alone, but I really enjoyed reading it too. Smiley face. Nice man. Skillful use of descriptions really painted a picture. Random question I thought while reading this, are you still as crazy as you were in your younger days, or have you toned it down / cut it out completely? That was excellent, good to read some local lore on here. As a recent graduate with a college degree in the humanities, I can safely say that this is more written than some of the stuff I've had to read. Well done. I'd upvote you twice if I could. Impressively creepy, my good sir. You probably should have used more drugs. Also, impressive job. Great writing. Really enjoyed it, man. The most frightening part was the drugs, rotting garbage, and number of people. Jesus, man. Wow. Delightful story. That would creep me out. I love your writing style. You should draft short stories about your earlier crazy years. It would be a great read. Hunter S. Thompson and friends have lived in a haunted house for about a year. Then a skeleton pops out.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.